This is session 8 of Tax Summit Week 2021. Today's session is Supply Chain Resilience. And at this time, I'm pleased to turn our call over to our first presenter, Mike Fletcher. Mike?
Thank you, Allison, and welcome everyone. Welcome to Tax Summit and welcome to this session on supply chain resiliency. I hope you all had a chance to enjoy the overture that opens up every one of these sessions. I know I always enjoy listening to the Marriage of Figaro and the overture there. It's a welcome way to start each of these sessions. It's a great piece of music, so I hope everybody has a chance to enjoy that before the sessions. It's very unusual in a tax summit environment for us to have topics that are really the primary economic and business topics of the nation and globally. And here we have two that have transpired and fit perfectly into that context. Dave Cotter did a great opening session on Monday, and the issues around the Biden plan are paramount in the business community right now. And it's very rare to have topics in a tax summit be that important to the business community. And so it's really interesting to see that transpire. But this topic also is equally prevalent. You can't go an hour without reading or hearing about a supply chain related issue in the US or globally and its impact on our economy and the expectations for its impact on the global economy. So this is an important dialogue from both a tax perspective and from a business perspective. And we've assembled a unique team to try to encompass a broader scope of that dialogue. So with you today are people that have expertise in indirect taxation like VAT, with expertise in operational transfer pricing, with customs duties and trade expertise, but also with expertise in the systems and processes and technologies that go along with creating and managing and developing resilient supply chains. And so we're looking forward to a robust dialogue that includes not only tax topics, but topics that cover the totality of the supply chain issues that we see. So we're going to take a few minutes and do some introductions, and then we'll dive into the panel discussion. I would say that we would like this to be a dialogue, and so to the extent that you have questions or brief experiences that you would want to share, we're prepared to try to address them in the course of this panel discussion. So please feel free to submit them into the Q&A process, and we'll try to get them along the way as we work through the issues that we want to address. So I'm Mike Fletcher. In the context of my role at RSM, I'm an enterprise account leader here, which means that my focus is on organizations that have significant growth aspirations, are multinational in nature. And while my background is as a tax partner, my focus is on helping the firm deliver value across the totality of the enterprises that we work with. And over the course of the last couple of years, as I've entered into this enterprise account leadership program, I've learned a lot about the systems and technologies and processes that we're able to implement and develop for our clients, as well as continuing to work on tax matters for clients. So let's move to hear introductions from the rest of the panel. Anju, ladies first, would you like to kick us off, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Anju Singh. I am the National Leader for Operational Transfer Pricing at RSM. I have over 20 years of management consulting experience working with tax and transfer pricing and finance and IT functions. My specialty is in improving the operational efficiencies of tax and transfer pricing functions, whether it is in the automation of certain functions like price setting, cost allocations, or in using technologies to build data modeling and scenario planning capabilities. Also in the setting up of data marts, data warehouses to help tax functions to manage their data more efficiently. My past work has been involved in the end-to-end execution of intercompany transaction flows with the particular focus on the management of tax and transfer pricing controls and risks. From an industry standpoint, although technology and operations are somewhat industry agnostic, my prior engagements have been more skewed in the favor of more regulated industries like pharmaceuticals and medical devices or banking and finance. Lately, I'm doing also a lot of work with the consumer industrial product sectors. But very quickly, I would like to touch upon operational transfer pricing because it's a relatively new field and many of you may be wondering what it is. As we know, transfer pricing landscape is somewhat changing. The complexity is increasing on a regular basis. It has increased tremendously lately. And this is because of the volumes of data that we are dealing with today, or increased pressure, increased scrutiny from either media or tax authorities. This is why operational transfer pricing function has come into focus, because it blends the traditional transfer pricing technical capabilities with the technology systems and data capabilities and makes it a more powerful option to solve for the challenges faced by the transfer pricing function today. With that said, I'm very pleased to be on the panel, and I look forward to this discussion and will be happy to offer any viewpoints from tax, transfer pricing, and technology perspectives.
Thank you, Anju. Hey, Jake, how about you? Let's get out of the tax realm and hear from a pure consultant.
Sure, Mike, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning to my fellow West Coasters. I am on the West Coast today. My name is Jake Windquist. I'm a director in our strategy and management consulting function within RSM, and specifically I help to lead our national operations and supply chain practice. Also am an adjunct professor at University of San Diego in operations, teaching an operations management course there. And within RSM, I come from about 12 years of industry and consulting experience, split about half in industry, kind of, in purchasing departments and supply chain management functions. With RSM in operations and supply chain, we work with our consumer products companies, our industrial products with med device, med tech. Anytime we're, producing something, manufacturing something, or distributing it, we help across all areas of supply chain and operations, from sales and marketing to sales and operations planning, procurement, supply chain, manufacturing and distribution. Of course, these days, it would come as no surprise, the hot topic and the lion's share of our discussions are all around, trying to get at the question of, how do we as a client, as a firm, adapt to this changing demand profile, this changing, supply landscape, supply constraints. How do we manage this? Do we think about our manufacturing and distribution strategy? Do we think about how we plan for inventory, how we think about our forecasting and kind of integrated and collaborative planning approach? How do we manage our suppliers? How do we mitigate risk across the supply chain? And so those are really the areas that we've been focusing as of late, and rightfully so, because that's a lot of what we are all dealing with on a daily basis. So thanks for having me on this panel. Very excited for this discussion. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Jake. Mark Ludwig, how about you?
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's nice to be present with everybody here, and I appreciate the invitation to be part of this panel. Just by quick introduction, my own background is several decades in professional services, leading global trade and customs practices, and then also in industry, leading global supply chain operations for a few multinationals over the years. And it's a good combination, I think, for today's panel, mostly because this intersection of global supply chain operations, economics, and I guess government regulations, including taxes, as well as the other impediments that those regulatory environments can create for companies, is very relevant to not only what we're doing today, but even historically in that context, has always been one of the drivers to either constrain or foment global economic activity. And really in the last few decades, we've started to hear the terminology globalization. I think there's a lot of challenges still left towards get to that ideal state of globalization, and I think we're starting to see nation state actors and groupings of countries throwing their disproportionate weight around to try to influence outcomes and drive towards answers that are right for them and may be detrimental to others. So it's those governing factors, it's those regulating bodies, whether they're supranational or local, that entire range of contributors to that shaping of the global supply chain environment and economic activity around the world really is where I think companies struggle to fit where their operations, how they deal with these uncertainties, the disruptions it all can create, and bring it all together. That's what I'm looking forward to potentially discussing with all of you today, and also maybe seeking if we can't get some frameworks to think about how do we approach the coming years and plan for the future to make the most of these disruptive times.
Thank you, Mark. Duncan Stocks, how about you?
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Duncan Stocks. I lead the global indirect tax team here in the US for the firm. I've got 30 plus years of VAT consulting experience. I'm based in Chicago. I came to Chicago just over 5 years ago to sort of start to build out a global indirect tax team. And it's been a fairly rapid journey, and a lot of it is centered around the dynamic of what the tax authorities are doing and the demands for growth in our client base. It's worth bearing in mind that there are about 170 countries around the world that operate a VAT system. And I think the recent statistics suggest that there's nearly $500 billion of VAT that goes missing every year. So tax authorities are putting a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus to bridge that gap, and they're putting in place new compliance procedures, which of course is at the heart of any sort of supply chain. I mean, if you think about it, VAT works both in terms of purchases and sales, not just on the sales side. And when products and services cross borders, that's where things start to become have the tendency to unravel as businesses don't fully understand their obligations, and that's where a lot of the leakage happens. So when we talk about supply chain in the context of this discussion today, we're probably talking mostly about cross-border movements of product, but it isn't just about cross-border movements of product. There are other areas as well, and increasingly, when you look at what's happened on the back of COVID and the move for some businesses to have more of an online strategy, that is creating a new type of supply chain or increasing the volume of a supply chain that existed for businesses that are doing direct consumer sales. That is also creating a lot of VAT compliance obligations on non-resident businesses. And that's a really important point to take away, is that you don't have to be present in a country to have a VAT obligation in that country, and that's where some of the complexity arrives. So we'll probably get into a bit more of that as we go through the conversation, Mike. But yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me to the panel.
Well, thanks for joining us, Duncan. I really appreciate you taking the time. Actually, for all of you, I appreciate you taking the time to join and participate. So let's dive into it. So one thing that I've seen interesting recently is that it's third quarter earnings release season for the public companies. And what we're seeing in some of these earning release reports is very specific dialogue around the effect of supply chain restrictions and limitations that exist in the marketplace. For example, I was listening to the earnings release for aerospace and defense contractor L3Harris on Thursday of last week. And the very first line in the CEO's commentary about their decline in revenues, and they've had about a 2% decline, was attributed to an electronics shortage. And that the electronics shortage was a result of all of these ships that we see backed up in Long Beach and Los Angeles, and the 200,000 containers that are sitting in that rail yard waiting transportation. Jake, what's transpiring there, and how will it eventually work its way out?
Yeah, Mike, well, you touched on a couple of things there, and as Paul Hollywood might say, it's a bit of a mess. on the supply side, and if we think about, sort of the leading example of, microchips, this was something that started before the pandemic, right? Where we had tariffs, we had, trade wars and export bans, and that started to, dwindle chip inventories within the U.S. Chinese buyers were hoarding them. And of course, the pandemic hit and really exacerbated that issue. When pandemic hits, we had, buyers like car companies, for as a good example, cut orders in anticipation of slow demand. Factories, sort of the zero COVID policy in China and the surrounding areas shut down, so production stopped. And then, of course, demand picked up very, very fast. Everyone's at home, and we need to set up and outfit our home offices. And so we started ordering a bunch of, laptops and tablets and monitors and, new smartphones as well. And so that just created this immediate sort of influx of demand over supply. Add to that, extreme weather. So it's a bit of a perfect storm. Interestingly, if we look at, sector by sector, obviously automotive has been hit the most, outside of Toyota, which is an interesting point. But, we're on this path where it's still certainly an issue. You have, as you alluded to, kind of the L3, you have sort of the earlier winners, even like an Apple, who, for a while had some of that, committed inventory from the beginning. But as they roll out the iPhone 13, they're even starting to feel the burn from a manufacturing and from a chip shortage perspective. So, look, the factories need to catch up, and they are, but we are still in this imbalance. And, our economists see this starting to level out, but not really until, the middle of next year. And that's on the using microchips as an example. If we look at, the downstream kind of supply chain impact here, well, you alluded to the containers. There's a lot there as well. Just by way of, a quick background here, what happened with the containers? Well, again, early days of the pandemic, we had the shipping companies, sidelining their capacity, canceling certain routes because of anticipated slower demand. And oh, by the way, there was an immediate need of PPE coming out of China and going all around the world. And going to countries where they needed containers full of PPE, well, they also didn't have a whole lot of product to put back in those containers and ship back. So now we had this inventory of containers kind of scattered around the world. And then at the same time, we have all this consumables, durable good, spike in demand that we wanted out of China to come in, and we didn't have the right containers in the right place. And so there was a scramble to get containers back to China to ship. We had an influx of demand coming over on shipping containers to the Port of Long Beach and others. That's why you see the spike, tenfold in container prices. And oh, by the way, we have labor shortages at the port, and so we don't have the right labor, enough labor to offload the ships in a timely manner, causing a backlog of ships, waiting or anchored out, waiting to be offloaded. And then even further downstream, we don't have enough truckers to take the containers from the yard to the end or to the companies that purchase those goods. And so, again, a lot there, a bit of a mess. It needs to catch up, and it will, but it may take some time still.
Thanks, Jake. It's really interesting. Let's get some feedback from our audience on some of these issues. Let's do our first polling question now and see how significant the issues around supply chain synchronization have affected our participants. So we've got 5 options here for folks to choose from. While we're waiting for people to make their choices, Anju, maybe a comment around the implications of COVID from a transfer pricing perspective. We've seen some companies have profits allocated differently in different countries than what they expected. So while we're getting responses, maybe some thoughts from you about those issues? Anju?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, totally. The pandemic has totally created a lot of challenges from a tax transfer pricing perspective as well. When we start to look at some of the impacts, especially given the profitability as well as the risk assessment of each of these entities. I mean, that's is creating a lot of challenges, from a transfer pricing aspect. Who bears the risk of some of these significant losses or significant profits that have come through? There was a period when for 5 or 6 months when things were completely locked down. Some of the manufacturers, some of those limited risk distributors were having significant losses or significant disruptions in their business. And then, economies opened up and that caused a lot of, a shift from loss to a profit situation. And that's basically starting to hit on our policies, our transfer pricing policies, how adaptable they are, how rigid they have been. It has totally, put it out for us to have a concern about it, because that is something that was not anticipated, and that is something that we have seen to be a major challenge. How to make these policies more adaptable, how to have the risk monitoring such that in future when these kinds of disruptions happen, our policies are in place such that they are flexible enough for us to handle these changes.
I'm glad you raised the word policy, Anju, because I think policies had so much of an impact around supply chain and its resiliencies. I mean, Mark, do you want to comment a little bit about the policy issues related to trade wars and the effects that it's had on the movement of goods?
Sure. If we dial back the clock a little bit, we go back to 2016, 17, there were already some developing matters that took a while to play out. And those related to the growing influence of China on the world stage as the engine or the manufacturing base for most of the developed markets globally. And I think there was an attempt to try to counter some of that, as well as potentially influence what was perceived to be China's behavior in terms of market penetration, increasing its economic growth, as well as obtaining market share. So in the US, that took the shape of the imposition of these through trade policy, back to your point on policy, Mike, through trade policy, the imposition of these what's known as Section 301 tariffs, these additional tariffs on goods from China. So what the effect of that is this is pre-COVID. So the effects that we're feeling today all ultimately have some of their foundations, not all, but some of their foundations in what happened almost 4 or 5 years ago. And the way it's playing out is at the beginning in 2018, as these tariffs started to become applicable, companies starting to appreciate that, all right, well, we have a buildup of inventory and we can go ahead and absorb this because this probably won't be something that will happen for very long. And China will adjust to the US's expectations. And it didn't work that way. China, in fact, doubled down and basically imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. items going into China. And they didn't behave exactly the way the U.S. thought that the reaction would be or should be. So another year or so later, as companies continue to pull down this inventory that hadn't been subject to these additional costs, and I'm talking double-digit tariffs, where a lot of things were coming from China pre-2018 at 0 or 2 or 3, 4% tariffs, which were quite easily to absorb, considering the arbitrage of China labor in the boat transfers, the shipping vessels, and the slower supply chain costs associated with lack of velocity. All those started to have an impact. And then you hit COVID. And then demand starts being tremendously disruptive, and the expectation of future demand and the uncertainty, what happened, and then the unevenness of it all in terms of getting a solid footing underneath these different global economies, depending on how COVID played out there. Nonetheless, these China tariffs continue to pace, and companies started to realize our inventories are really dropping to a low level, so these China tariffs are really starting to hurt, really starting to feel the pain here. And if we couldn't get an exclusion from the U.S. government because we had a good business case why those tariffs shouldn't apply to us, we're stuck dealing with it. So we either absorb it and consume our margin, or we pass it on to our customer or find some balance in between. And if we pass it to the customer, the prices go up to the customer, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the seeds of where we're at today already being planted 3, 4, 5 years ago. And it's played out in COVID times as these economies find the footing. COVID starts to seem like it's a little bit more under control than at the outset here. And there's the expectation that recoveries are underway while demand shoots up. So all the things that we heard about the different elements that have caused the current state that Jake walked us through, part of this also is related to the policy position of the U.S. government in these actions it took some years ago that have not been walked back, mostly because the China response has not been what was expected. Nonetheless, I don't see that changing. So the rush for inventory buildup, the lack of labor to produce and move that inventory around, the demand for products that is increasing, the inflationary pressures, all of these things will probably continue apace, I would say, as Jake mentioned, and our economists are suggesting probably well into 2022 and potentially even further. So trade policy is part of the reason that this is playing out the way it has.
Thanks, Mark. Very, very interesting. Duncan, we're going to do a polling question now. But while we're looking at the polling question, Duncan, would you mind commenting on what's transpired with VAT and the status of VAT holidays that were granted during COVID and whether those are continuing and what the implications are for folks that are incurring VAT? And while Duncan's doing that, we're also asking this question related to supply chain disruptions and the vulnerability related to them. So if you could all take a look at those and pick one of those as your answer, we'll listen to Duncan while you're making your choices.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for that. And of course, the reliefs that were introduced during the COVID period were really targeted. In the majority of cases, they were targeted to particular industry sectors. There was relief for PPE, there was relief for the hospitality sector, there was relief for the timing of making payments for VAT returns. And these reliefs are starting to wind down. I mean, I think it's with a positive spin on this, we're coming out of the COVID era. So they are winding down. There are still some reliefs out there, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that as businesses and governments and countries come out of COVID, that there is actually now a shortfall of tax revenue, and so the consequence of all of these reliefs over the past 18 months means that there is now going to have to be new tax policies that are brought into place for governments to start to pay back all the money they've borrowed around the world. And VAT is one of those taxes that is actually quite easy for governments to work with. And I kind of want to come back a little bit, if I may, on something that Jake mentioned earlier on. It's kind of relevant because when we talk about COVID, COVID has changed the way that we operate globally now. I mean, there's a lot more remote working and there's a lot more home working. And businesses are now being asked to equip home offices for their staff. And that's changing the way that suppliers of office furniture, of office equipment are being asked to sort of deliver products. So they're asking now to deliver product directly to people's homes rather than directly to the company facility. And that's introducing new VAT obligations that might not have existed before. So as we come out of COVID, keeping an eye on how those changes in the way that we're going to do business going forward is really important. And although you trade with a company, if you're delivering to a person, the person, the employee, is not going to take on that VAT obligation. So somebody has to pick that up, and it's either going to be the vendor, the supplier, or it's going to be the employing entity that does that. So I think although there are reliefs still available, I think as we come out of it, we're going to see some more enforcement around non-compliance as well as new compliance arrangements.
Really interesting, Duncan. Let's stick with the policy issue a little bit longer here. One of the things that I find fascinating about supply chain related governmental policy is the area that the mandates are being directed to. And one thing that we've seen is the Biden administration's focus on mitigating certain technologies that are encompassed in the supply chain. And this actually dates back to the preceding administration, where the DoD issued regulations last summer, and those regulations mandated that certain Chinese technologies be excluded from DoD-related supply chains. And further, that an aerospace and defense contractor or a government contractor needs to be able to attest and certify to the fact that their supply chain is free from all of these Chinese or undesirable technologies. And when the list came out initially, there were 5 companies that were named. They're the 5 companies that we've heard a lot in the news, but over time, that list has grown to over 200 companies. And the transparency requirement is not just a transparency requirement at the first level of contracting, it's throughout the totality of the subcontracting structure for contractors. So, I mean, Jake, think about the data requirements the onus of the data requirements that are out there for one of these contractors that now has to be able to certify that their supply chain, the totality of it, is free from undesirable foreign actor technologies and equipment, and what that means to the way they gather and maintain data and the way they analyze it.
Yeah, Mike, what's interesting about, from our perspective, kind of focusing in on supply chain operations, with our clients in the middle market, what I find fascinating about technology is they seem to have evolved quicker on the front end. If we think about customer relationship management and sales intake and sales order processing, there's a lot of systems being leveraged today, and I mean, you often hear about how COVID sort of propelled businesses into the future a bit, right? And sort of embracing further automation within some of their systems and processes. On the back end, when you look at forecasting, advanced planning, and what you alluded to is kind of what we might think about as plan for every part and all the intricacies of every item, and throughout the supply chain, not just tier 1, but tier 2, tier 3. Where is it coming from? How is it packaged? Where is it moving? What borders is it crossing? Those. We haven't seen the same sort of adoption yet. Yeah, I mean, today, of course, all in discussion, and what is the right system? Where are there just, we haven't seen sort of the emergence of that kind of leading, CRM or a Shopify, if you will. And so, Mike, it's a great conversation to have, but this is very, very real. And you said it, there's a lot of data elements, underneath every single item, raw material, finished good, And so that's a lot of data to manage, to grab a hold of, to obtain and organize and to acknowledge. So a lot of discussions. We are we partner with a few software platforms that are helping with this visibility throughout the supply chain. Others that run more advanced planning scenarios and advanced planning modules and even advanced forecasting to help with all of these things.
Hey, Mark and Duncan, how do I calculate if I want to analyze the cost of an item that goes through my supply chain? How do I know what the totality of the costs related to landing that good in my factory really are? What kinds of attributes and issues impact that cost, and what kinds of information is out there about the elements of those costs?
Well, I'll start, perhaps, and Duncan can support or contradict what I might be saying here, but I believe a lot of it starts really at the very beginning to the order process. And your order to your supplier is the spark that then puts them into action, which drives their orders to their suppliers. And there is almost every supply chain has more than one, order/invoice transaction along the way. So to have visibility up and down that supply chain is tremendously challenging, and some companies never achieve that. So what they know is what they have direct control and visibility into, and that's it. So they're going off perhaps of the vendor invoice out of their overseas manufacturing facility, and they see a total number, but they don't know what all actually is behind all that number. What's the amount for the margin? What's the amount for the labor? What's the admin, the G&A, and all those elements behind it? And so they see an invoice, and that's really the starting point of most information systems, is that invoice or the order is where the spark begins. But the reality is there's a lot more behind it and a lot of detail that most companies are used to tracking is not related to the granularity necessary for the product by product or the part by part analysis that can be done and probably needs to be done to have a full picture of, you've heard the terminology, total landed cost, right? But that's the landed cost of it, but it's not necessarily the cost through the end of the life of the product, right? Because that's usually just to get it into a particular place or a market, but there's additional costs that then tack on to further move it into that market, to distribute it down the chain, to handle it, to warehouse it, etc. So the visibility for most companies is very limited, very myopic, not necessarily from their own faults, but really just the design of the arm's length transactions that we have to have that then have to be supported before the taxing authorities. So this maybe is a good point to hand off to Duncan because that one of those key taxing authorities, of course, is the VAT authority, which sees the transactions, the order, the invoice, and that's what it's focused on primarily, those operational transactions and the taxes associated with that. Duncan?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I wouldn't dream of contradicting you. But just to complement the point there, I mean, I think when we talk about cross-border movements of goods, and particularly when we're dealing with imported product, VAT is the last tax that gets added on to the value of whatever's been imported after the duty has been assessed and after the valuation has been arrived at. And for the majority of businesses, that VAT, that import VAT, really shouldn't be a cost. So in some respects, we don't really mind what the value is because we're going to be able to recover it. But we're only going to be able to recover it if the documentation is correct and the process was properly followed. And unfortunately, more often than not, or not more often than not, but certainly frequently, that's not the case. And I think it's, when businesses are looking at their supply chain processes and their compliance procedures and their documentation and working with third parties, they just need to keep in mind that, you know, if you are going to incur a VAT expense on importation, that there ought to be a mechanism to claim that VAT expense back. And if you're absorbing that as a cost, then that is certainly something that should be looked at. We've got examples of companies that have either got incomplete documentation or incorrectly created documentation, and it's very difficult after the fact to go back in and claim back this VAT without doing a whole bunch of extra work. It's far better to try and get it up front. But certainly as a takeaway, I would say that, you know, VAT shouldn't, in the majority of cases, be a cost to supply chain. It's a compliance burden, but it shouldn't be a cost.
Thank you, Duncan. Let's shift to our third polling question. And while we're having folks give us input on this question, maybe you could comment a little bit for us on one more policy issue, and that would be the OECD policymaking doctrine that we've seen come out recently. That looks like it's going to have potentially far-reaching effect. Do you want to comment on that while folks are addressing polling question number 3, please?
Sure. Well, you know, I mean, like what we're hearing, so many disruptions, so much uncertainty, and amidst all that, there's also this huge shift that's happening in the world of international taxation, right? I mean, many of you may have heard in the news, it was last month, I guess, on October 8th, 136 countries representing more than 90% of global GDP came together to do an overhaul of our existing tax system. This is big news, because it will be the first substantial renovation of international tax rules in almost 100 years. What I'm talking about is BEPS 2.0, and it's basically a two-step program which is aimed at taxation of the digital economy. Pillar 1, as they call it, is focused on the digital economy, and Pillar 2, which is a lot in the news. You may have heard President Biden talk about it over the weekend during the G20 summit in Rome. It was once again endorsed by the G20 nations, is basically a concept of global minimum tax, which is set at 15%. What it does is basically it puts countries on a more level playing field and puts a stop on what it's called race to the bottom. So as I said, October 8th, it was announced, widely accepted by the global community. This has a major impact on our supply chain considerations, given the fact that up until now, majority of our planning considerations have been based on location-specific advantages, right? So countries which are offering tax incentives, or countries which have low cost of labor, they factored more heavily in our supply chain planning decisions. And but BEPS sort of removes many of those tax advantages and makes it a level playing field, as I mentioned. So go forward, we anticipate that the impact of BEPS would be that companies will start taking a more broader view of their supply chain, to start thinking about it more from an agility and resilience standpoint. Also, another point that I would layer in here is the rapid digitalization of the global economy, right? What we are seeing in the last 18 months since the pandemic, the expansion of e-commerce, the adoption of digital capabilities at a scale that was never seen before. We need to be able to consider some of the impacts of BEPS on these digital companies. Like I said, BEPS was developed primarily for the taxation of digital economy. And even though the implementation is yet to come, it'll be important for us to start to keep in mind some of those long-term impacts and when we are making the supply chain decisions.
Thank you, Anju. So moving along to maybe out of the policy dialogue, more into what I call modeling or options or building resiliency dialogue. Jake, if I wanted to change my sourcing, if I wanted to move from China to Vietnam, or Mark, if I wanted to move sourcing into the US rather than outside of the US, are there modeling tools out there? I mean, it seems to me like there's potentially a vast amount of data. We've actually talked about the fact that there's a vast amount of data out there. How does one go about modeling the implications of a change in sourcing? And are we seeing resourcing transpiring?
I'll start that off, Mike, and I'll maybe start by addressing there's a kind of a comment question in the Q&A, and why manufacturers stop insuring supply of parts required for complete creation of the finished good. It's a great comment, and kind of to use the microchip example, why did automotive fall to the back of the line? Automotive is priority number 4 for the chip makers. Well, because they kind of cut their orders at the beginning of the pandemic, and they fell to the back of the line, and then chip makers controlling a limited amount of inventory. If you're a supplier, right, you're kind of going to go to the highest bidder, and those were those early kind of demand spike, cloud computing, electronics manufacturers that went way to the head of the line. We have another a vitamin maker client that had a similar issue, and look, your supply or the production of your product is only as good as the weakest link. So if there's 11 ingredients that you need to make a vitamin or a supplement, and you can't get one of them, well, guess what? You're not making that product. So you may have surplus of inventory in your warehouse on the other 10, but you can't get that one. And frankly, you may not have the leverage with that supplier to commit to that. It'd be great to think that suppliers and the holders of inventory, out of the goodness of their heart, will provide it to the customer most in need. But that, unfortunately, that's just not the reality. And so, kind of carrying along with that, it requires this, Mike, analysis, as you said, first analysis, and it's almost a risk analysis, a risk assessment, of the things that I'm purchasing from around the world. What are the top 5, 10, 20% based on these parameters? What are the top 20 risk items? Is it geopolitical in nature? Is it, a location that's prone to extreme weather events? Locations with historical, supply delays or shortages. And so we have to identify those. And that leads us into more of that modeling exercise of, okay, well, where else could I procure this? Or, what might this look like? Do I need an alternative source? Do I need to establish more of a buffer? And
or am I willing to accept a higher price point for something that I need in exchange for having a more resilient supply chain?
Exactly. And so we've actually been partnering with a software called Simio, which is more around, kind of advanced planning and supply chain scenario modeling, which is really, really cool. And it is helping with a lot of those analyses, total landed cost, as was mentioned before, distribution and analytics as well. The resiliency, I love this discussion, and resiliency to me, it really means something different to everyone in every firm, just based on the decision making and what's really important and valuable to that firm.
Yeah, we did this session 2 weeks ago to the Chamber of Commerce and Manufacturing Division in Omaha, Nebraska. And one of the questions that we got out of that session was, are we seeing resourcing to the U.S.? Are we seeing production move back to the U.S.? And at least the answer to that audience was no, and it was no partly because those kinds of changes are very long-term decision-making kinds of changes, very expensive changes. But even if it was something that you could do in the short term, there was no labor force to be able to conduct the manufacturing processes here. And so it seems like there's this significant impact of what Duncan mentioned earlier, the workforce issues on any resourcing initiatives in supply chain resiliency building?
You know, so much investment has been made in the globalized economy and the global manufacturing and distribution strategies of our clients and these firms. It is a very long-term discussion. You know, this is not the first time, right, that we've had this discussion, right? You know, any major, weather event or extreme weather event has happened, this resiliency discussion always comes up. And, you know, from our perspective, Mike, it's less about a total kind of onshore move. Now, sure, there's, you know, Duncan alluded to this earlier, you know, around bringing our distribution closer to our customers. I think that's very relevant. But for us, it's you know, the conversations that we are having and where it's leading to is just a more collaborative and communicative supply chain planning process to identify where potential risks are, work with our suppliers to share that burden, so that we can adapt very quickly and respond to, you know, the next supply chain disruption.
Yeah, and it seems that it has to be on some sort of order of magnitude context where you're able to build in different variables on a fairly short-term basis to understand what options are available to you and what the total landed cost would be relative to those options, or the VAT implication, or the transfer pricing and other cost implications to that alternative that you're considering. We've got a few minutes left. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, Mike, one of the interesting in the context of what Jake was saying, that earlier this year, a study came out by a consulting firm that found that for the first time in over 20 years, you know, back up 20 years, and you're at the dawn of the true globalization, the emergence of China as that superpower economically. And for the first time in 20 years, it was found that trade, and this is just this year and last year, trade among neighboring countries was growing faster than trade between different countries and different regions. What's that saying? What's saying is there hasn't been this massive resourcing initiative that happened on a whim, right? It wasn't necessarily sparked just by one thing, but I think the pullback has starting to happen towards closer to market sourcing, one, in the interest of some supply chain resiliency. I think companies are coming to appreciate over the last decade or so, it is important not to have such an extended global just-in-time supply chain, because disruptions do happen, and when they happen, they're quite severe. So I think you're starting to see these trade blocks, right? You have NAFTA being renegotiated as USMCA is one example. That is meant to modernize, update, and encourage a little bit more production activity happening closer to the major markets. You're seeing the same happening in Europe. You're seeing in some of these Asian countries that are banding together and restriking some of their existing trade arrangements so they can provide a little bit more certainty in their own markets for national security reasons, for certainty of supply, to help supplement and complement all of the analysis that companies do in planning and forecasting, as well as the safety stocks, the redundancy that they're building in. That's an interesting development. It's the first time in 20 years. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the brakes have been fully pumped on globalization, but I think what's happened the last few years starting to increase the appreciation that continued extended global supply chain and hoping for the lean just-in-time in all cases is not necessarily the only path or the most realistic path in today's world.
I think one other thing we're seeing too from a modeling perspective is an assumption that this is not the last pandemic and that the next one will come in a much nearer term. We do some work in the government contracting sector, and their government customers are asking these contractors to help the government begin to scenario plan for next pandemic in a 3 to 8 year time frame. And I think a lot of the commercial operators are seeing that and are starting to build that into their modeling process as well. And so the idea of having maybe a higher cost but a more resilient supply chain is something that's spreading across the supply chain network. So let's go to our last polling question. And while we do that, Duncan and Anju, I'd kind of like to hear your predictions for the kind of near term. What do you think will transpire that'll affect things like transfer pricing and VAT and supply chain issues related to those areas?
Well, I'm happy to, ladies first, by all means, Anju.
Okay. Well, prediction-wise, I mean, I would suggest. I mean, in my view, I think the supply chain of the future will look very different. And mainly, why I say this is because of the trend that we are seeing today. Towards digitalization, right? How it will be hard to tell from digital companies from non-digital companies very soon. I do expect that a lot of companies will move towards this digital trend of delivery and e-commerce and everything else that we are seeing. And so supply chain will have to morph to suit these models. My other, if I may say, trend or prediction that I'm seeing is the impact of BEPS will become broader. Right now, it's only impacting the largest companies of the world, but OECD has already made its intent more clear that it will be extended in due time. I do anticipate that tax leaders will be playing a much bigger role because as we are seeing all of these supply chain disruptions and challenges, there's a need to look at it from an end-to-end view such that we have a better grasp of how the supply chain changes impacts tax and vice versa. So that is definitely an area that I see in the coming years being expanded. And last but not the least, I do expect, and that is something that Duncan, you had touched upon earlier, I do anticipate, given the fact that there was almost a $30 trillion of stimulus spending by governments around the world, nations will be hungrier for revenue. And one of the things one of the tools that's available to tax authorities is the audits. And I do anticipate that there will be an increase in the stimulus spending. Duncan?
Yep. Duncan, last comments?
Just 1 minute then. I mean, I think one of the things I'm anticipating over the coming years is an increase in environmental policies with a new tax framework around that. I think there's going to be an increased level of taxation on those companies who are not very green and more incentive to those companies that are green. So I think we're going to see encouragement from government for companies to move more into a green direction. And we're starting to see that already. I mean, the UK, as an example, has introduced a plastic packaging tax, which will take effect in April next year. And I think we're going to see more of that initiative to sort of discourage air miles, improve the environmental impact that companies have. So, and that impacts on consumers. So I think that's my prediction, more green tax.
I agree. We didn't have quite enough time to spend to invest in ESG dialogue, but maybe that'll be a topic for next year's summit, because I think ESG is going to be the main area of focus from a governmental policy perspective. I see Jake shaking his head yes. So we really appreciate everybody hanging in there for an extra minute or so. We thank you for your time. Thanks for participating. Please reach out to any of us if you have additional questions, and we'd be happy to submit more dialogue. Again, Duncan, Jake, Mark, Anju, thank you very much for participating in the panel. You guys were terrific today, and I'll turn it back to Allison.
Thank you very much. And as a nice little bonus prize for a Tuesday afternoon, we're going to give you one more chance to answer the final poll. So if you can get that answered, go ahead and do that now while I'm going through our wrap-up remarks. We do, of course, invite you to join us in the networking lounge immediately following this session to chat further on this topic with the presenters from today's webcast. And, of course, if you're not registered for the remaining webcasts in our 2021 Tax Summit Week, please go to the plenary sessions location in the virtual environment and register for the sessions that we have tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. We did add an additional tech forum session for tomorrow afternoon as well, so be sure to check that out. And of course, the Tax Resources Library that is available to you as well, with a wealth of information across all kinds of topics. And if you have met CPE criteria for this webcast, you may download a copy of your certificate by visiting the Certification Center and clicking the download icon. Be sure to save a copy to your computer in the next few minutes before we conclude this event. Smartphone users can download their certificate from any computer at a later date using today's webcast link. And again, thank you so much for joining us for day 2, and we look forward to seeing you day 3 of RSM Tax Summit Week 2021. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.